This is Schools for Students, the podcast where I talk about what schools can do to maximize the positive outcomes of their low-income racialized students. I'm your host Mel, and today's topic is schools for agriculture. In today's episode, I'll be approaching schooling from a different lens, or should I say place. I say this because education doesn't only happen at school, and hopefully by the end of today's episode, I'll convince my fellow students and educators of the importance of establishing community gardens in their residences, especially if they're low income. What inspired this topic was a recent visit to a wealthy building in downtown Toronto. What caught my eye was a beautifully established community garden for the residents to use, something I had never seen in lower income buildings I'd been to. After briefly thinking about how convenient it must be for that building's residents to have a garden only a couple of floors away, I couldn't help but wonder how much more helpful a garden would be for residents in low income buildings. So in this week's episode, I'll be exploring how residential buildings, especially those in low income neighborhoods, would deeply benefit from community-centered gardens devoted to their residents to help tackle food insecurity and foster agricultural knowledge, both for adults and future generations of kids that'll take care of the planet. I'll get started by explaining why specifically low-income buildings should have community gardens and green spaces for their residents to use. I say it should be focused on low-income buildings because low-income residents are often located in food deserts. But what are food deserts, you might be asking? Well, they're populations that are often located in low-income areas and have less access to healthy food options. That is, grocery stores that have fresh fruits and vegetables, for example. Plenty of studies have found that both food deserts and food insecurity disproportionately impact low-income individuals, which means that if you're low income, you're more likely to be facing food hunger and or being located in an area with less access to nutritious foods. Through general knowledge, I'm sure my listeners can put together the general detrimental health impacts food deserts must cause. But since this is a podcast about students, I must do my due diligence and inform you all of the health impacts food insecurity and food deserts have on kids. A study done by Siskin colleagues in 2023 found that kids are the most negatively impacted by food insecurity, stating that kids who grow up food insecure are left with an increased chance of, I quote, birth defects, anemia, cognitive issues, aggression, anxiety, asthma, depression, and suicide ideation, end quote. Showing that kids living in food insecurity end up with poor mental health and physical health compared to kids who grow up without food insecurity. It's also important to keep in mind the fact that low-income residents are often racialized people, and if you remember our last episode, racialized adults and kids are already struggling with systematic and generational racism, giving more reason as to why these residents deserve something like a garden that can be so helpful for both physical and mental health. As much as I am speaking about low-income neighborhoods in general, I emphasize the importance of gardens in buildings in my thesis, because of how densely populated they are and then how convenient a garden could be for said population. Recently, I learned from a feminist food studies textbook that people of low income, specifically mothers, want to buy organic and nutritious foods from places like farmers markets, but are unable to because of barriers like transportation, hindering them from making healthy choices. And as much as I love farmers markets, these obstacles are no easy feat. And that's why I emphasize green spaces in buildings so that low-income people don't have to worry about how far they have to travel and then the expenses relating to that to eat healthy and fresh produce. Well, why does it have to be community-based? Well, due to capitalism and neoliberalism, the West has become increasingly focused on the capabilities and value of the individual and what they can do for said systems. Within these systems, individualism, I quote, emphasizes self-reliance, independence, and productivity, end quote. But what does individualism mean for people's health? Well, individualism is associated with worse mental wellness and social ties, meaning those who are more individualistic also tend to struggle with their mental health and struggle more in their interpersonal relationships. Looking back at what we've learned, low-income individuals already have a hard time with the threat of food hunger. That coupled with excruciating isolation from these systems and as a result, worsened mental health, and the racism people most likely have to face provides ample reason as to why low-income neighborhoods deserve these resources that can aid in their well-being, that being community gardens and the benefits that come from them. So how specifically does a shared garden strengthen the community? A study done by Polson and their colleagues aimed to find the benefits of community gardening in Baltimore, Maryland. They interviewed residents of low-income neighborhoods and discovered that a community garden was able to foster new relationships among neighbors and also served as a learning hub for those who wanted to start gardening but didn't know where to begin. This resulted in even stronger connections among residents since the garden motivated them to share planting techniques and nutritious recipes. The last thing they found was that a shared green space itself helped their participants recuperate their city For example, the community garden was not just a garden, but it became a place where people could spend time with one another doing community-based and community-building activities. Essentially, having an open access garden for everyone to use created a stronger sense of community for the study's participants. Another study done by Teague and colleagues found that community gardening could foster novel relationships that would not have happened if it weren't for the community garden. The study also found that a shared space cultivated a strong sense of trust among the gardeners, since they had to entrust one another with their plants in that shared garden. And due to these circumstances, these relationships among gardeners extended past plants over time and genuinely created a community among individuals and what it means to care about one another. Since this is a podcast about students, I must also explain the benefits of community gardens for kids. In a review of the benefits of community school gardens, researcher Dr. Blair found that gardens can teach young people more than just how to plant certain flowers, vegetables, fruits, but gardening can teach kids about sustainability in their food consumption and how to deal with produce and agriculture waste. They also found that kids with a history of positive agriculture exposure are more likely to grow up as individuals who care more about the planet and nature. A later study done by Horning and colleagues in 2017 was able to replicate similar findings, except they were examining summer gardening cooking programs for students. They found that even after a couple of months of learning the ins and outs of gardening, cooking, and agriculture, students reported higher levels of community engagement and connectedness, later stating in the report that what youth learn in a community garden, quote, can play an instrumental role in preparing our young people to be caring and capable contributing members of society, end quote. These studies show that kids can learn about agriculture early on and utilize that knowledge for the rest of their lives, so long as seeds exist, feed themselves, and they can cook for themselves. And because they grow up learning the importance and the intricacies of food systems and sustainability, they can bring that knowledge with them later into their adult life, caring more about the planet and the food that comes from it. And I just want to end off this podcast by giving some suggestions of how individuals and kids can start organizing their community gardens themselves in their own buildings. So the first thing I suggest is to start by figuring out the types of food you want to grow. I'd say herbs are great, an easy, low-maintenance start if you're on the busier side and maybe don't have a lot of time to devote to gardening. You don't really have to take care of them as much as you do other plants. And 2, I'd start organizing clubs with other farmers, gardeners, or people that are just interested in your area to share what you know about gardening and to start a garden. And 3, I'd make sure to check your building's regulations to see any restrictions you might face when you do start gardening or when you do start a community garden. And that's the end of today's episode. I hope you all liked it, I hope you learned something, and I hope I influenced some of you to start gardening. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!